Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alberto Vargas. I'm the Associate Director of LACIS, the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program here at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And Professor Patrick Iver from the History Department is going to introduce our speaker today. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Alberto. It's nice to be here to greet those of you in the room and those of you who are joining us online. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Adela Cedillo back to the University of Wisconsin, where she did her PhD, graduating 2 years ago, is it?
4 years ago.
Oh,
4 years ago.
2019. Adela was here.
What's my advice?
Well, so Adela joined, well, she was here during a moment of transition for the department. So she came in as a Heath Stern student, and then he retired suddenly and I was hired. And so we worked together, but I give Steve a lot of the credit and I give Adela a lot of the credit because the work that she has done is not only historically important and theoretically sophisticated, but it's also the kind of work that is difficult to research. And I would say, in contrast to many, including myself, genuinely brave to carry out some of the work that she has done. In any case, her research interests include, as we will see, revolutionary movements, counterinsurgency warfare, the war on drugs, human rights, and female activism. She's published several book chapters and peer-reviewed articles on guerrilla organizations, anti-drug campaigns, and forced disappearance in Mexico. Is the author of El Fuego y el Silencio, Historia de las Fuerzas de Liberación Nacional Mexicanas, and the co-editor of Challenging Authoritarianism in Mexico, and is currently working on a book project that comes out of her dissertation, examining the intersections of the Dirty War and the first war on drugs in the 1970s in northwestern Mexico. She currently teaches at the University of Houston and will be presenting today a talk called A Comparative Perspective on the Dirty Wars of Mexico, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. Okay, we've got
Thank you.
40 minutes.
40 minutes. I know, sometimes I talk too much, so please let me know when my time is over. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Alberto. Thank you, LACIS, for the invitation. The University of Wisconsin is my alma mater. I haven't been here since I left the city in 2019. So I am here and I feel shocked, like, with these nostalgic feelings, like, well, this was home for so long. So now I am very happy to be back. So today I'm gonna, well, and I appreciate that my students are here. I think they are a large part of the online audience. So thank you guys for joining. So the topic that I'm going to address, well, is Patrick already mentioned what I do. So this is a new project that, well, I just finished a book chapter, an article that I sent for to be peer reviewed in a journal, and it's my most recent research, which is a comparative analysis on the Mexican Dirty War in relationship with the Dirty Wars in South America. So until the end of the 20th century, the historiography of the so-called dirty wars, or the period of state terrorism that occurred between the 1960s and mid-1990s in most Central and South American countries, excluded the Mexican case. So there was an alleged Mexican exceptionalism that was based on the questionable notion that, unlike the rest of the region, Mexico had a political system with a hegemonic party that was very stable, that was authoritarian but not dictatorial, and that preferred the cooptation of social movements rather than their physical elimination. The scholarship also wrongly assumed that Mexico did not have significant armed movements, unlike some Latin American counterparts. Most importantly, Mexico lacked a collective memory socially transmitted to new generations about anything resembling a dirty war. In consequence, Mexico is still excluded from comparative analysis related to the political violence during the Cold War. However, we learn about this conflict in a rather episodic way. For instance, from the 1990s, survivors of the Mexican Dirty War began to narrate their experiences through testimonies written testimonies mostly, and memoirs, and some renowned writers like Héctor Aguilar Camín and Carlos Montemayor published novels that had the conflict as a backdrop. But it was not until the party alternation in 2000, with the triumph of Vicente Fox from the National Action Party, that one of the historical demands of the victims of repression was fulfilled: the opening of the archives of the national security apparatus that were deposited in the National Archive of Mexico, the Archivo General de la Nación. In the face of pressure by human rights organizations to create a truth commission to settle accounts with the past, President Fox opted for the formation of the Special Prosecutor's Office for Social and Political Movements of the Past. That was the name. It was a very long name that did not make sense, but yeah, that was the name. It was not a truth commission. So Mexico was the first country in Latin America that have a special prosecution office rather than a truth commission. So this the problem with this special prosecutor's office was that it was on the office that was in charge of this special office was the Attorney General of the Republic, which was also responsible for many of or most of the crimes of the Dirty War, as long as it failed to prosecute the perpetrators. So of course, I will mention that later. But this Special Prosecutor's Office opened prosecution files related to the massacres of 1968 and 1971, and the hundreds of forced disappearances and extrajudicial executions that happened during the conflict. But these prosecutions failed, and I hope I have time to explain that later, because there was not really political willingness to address these atrocities in a way that delivered justice to the victims. But the office, this Special Prosecutor Office, failed to name the period like in a way that made sense for the public opinion. So the period remained unnamed, but it was informally called as the Dirty War. So there was no name, there was no justice, there was no memory. So you might ask, what's going on with the Mexican Dirty War? Well, it's all this about. So journalists, students, and academics had access to the testimonies of the victims and survivors of the conflict. The classified archives, I told you, the archives of the National Archive, the General Archive, the prosecution files that were leaked. There were constantly, the Office of the Special Prosecutors was constantly leaking information to mass media, which was very odd. And with all this information, they began to delve into that forgotten period of Mexican history. So what we know about the Mexican Dirty War is because of journalists and scholars mostly, not because of institutional efforts, not even by efforts made by the civil society. So this is a very unique case in Latin America, I think. So the picture that emerged from this research left no doubt about the existence of an extended state policy based on terror against the armed opposition, and also to some minor social movements to some extent, which in quantitative terms was far away from the cases of Chile or Argentina. Yeah, Mexico doesn't have as many victims as in those countries. But in qualitative terms, this repression was identical. The Mexican security forces, national security forces, use exactly the same methods that any other armies in the region, armies and police agencies. So Gilbert Joseph, this renowned historian of the Latin American Cold War, he points out that, well, in the region, most countries experience the emergence of a dialectic, I'm quoting here, a dialectic linking reformist and revolutionary projects of social change and national development with excessive counter-revolutionary responses. And Mexico was not the exception. Even though it still prevails the idea that what happened in Mexico was of a minor intensity or minor historical impact, Mexico, this period of violence in Mexico has been like the period that explains why Mexico is the country that is today, like a very violent country, like engulfed by the drug war and extreme political violence. So Mexico, because we neglected this period of the dirty war for so long, people don't understand what's going on in Mexico in present day. So not only my scholarship, but some scholars of this new generation that uncovered the dirty war have done a great deal of work to emphasize how important is the dirty war to understand Mexican history and understand the history of violence in the region, including Mexico, not excluding Mexico. So in this presentation, I want to reflect on the aspects of the Mexican dirty war that are comparable to other countries that also experience dirty wars or internal armed conflicts. In Latin America, there's a trend to call them not dirty wars anymore, but internal armed conflicts. There is a more appropriate name. And also I will reflect on the exceptional characteristics of the Mexican case. And finally, to conclude, reflecting on what the comparative analysis revealed. So the time frame that I have chosen is only the 60s and 70s, even though, well, all this period of violence lasted until the end of the Cold War in their mid-90s. There was this decade where of great activity, guerrilla activity in the region in any single country. I mean, I don't think of any country in Latin America that did not experience these local insurgencies. And there was also during this period, there was a global circulation of European Marxist currents and all the currents of from Asia and Africa, the anti-colonialist currents, which contributed to the configuration of Latin American projects of radical change. However, the way in which these currents were received, the local developments always influence the reception, direction, and ultimate meaning of the global political culture. And I'm using Victoria Langa's words here. So yeah, Latin America was a recipient of these ideologies, but Latin America was also the disseminator of its own local utopias and currents that mobilized large collectivities. For instance, Che Guevara's Wokismo, the liberation theology, Allende's peaceful path to socialism, and grassroots human rights movement, like conception, like human rights not as an institutional practice by lawyers, but something that is very organic, that is created grassroots. So that's very Latin America. That's a very Latin American thing, right? So the countries that I have chosen for the comparative analysis, the countries that I found more suitable are Brazil, Chile, and Argentina, to be compared with Mexico because, well, first, the geographical conditions, for instance, the large territorial extensions. These are the largest countries in the Americas. All of them have mountain ranges, coastal regions, diverse ecosystems. There's a relative synchrony in the beginning of each armed movement. All of them started in the 60s. There's also a similarity of counterinsurgency strategies. In every single country, we see like the same type of methods like torture, enforced disappearance, and I will explain this later. So this is important because, for instance, despite the geographical proximity of Mexico to Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, Mexico, the conflicts are very different. I mean, I would struggle to compare Mexico with Central America because, well, there's a different temporality, different geographical conditions, a different relationship with the United States. And the fact that in Central America, what started as low-intensity wars or dirty wars become like full-fledged civil wars, even though Reagan called them low-intensity wars. No, those were full-fledged civil wars, which clearly did not happen in any of the countries that I mentioned, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina, and Mexico. Those were not civil wars. So Mexico, so my argument is as follows. Mexico followed the same trajectory as Brazil, Chile, and Argentina in the following points. First, the emergence of organizations that adopted the socialist armed struggle, inspired by the currents, both international and domestic, that I have already mentioned. The expansion from Che Guevara's Wokismo to the protracted civil war, protected people were, which is the Maoist idea. Second, the expansion of a national security apparatus that apply global counterinsurgency methods. People tend to believe that Americans created the counterinsurgency school. That's not the case. With the French were pioneers, and the British. I mean, all the empires developed their own counterinsurgency schools. So when people think about Latin America, they say, "Oh, it's the school of the Americas, and the Americans are the evil guys." And give me a break. I mean, counterinsurgency was something global, something that was developing simultaneously. It started with empires, and then it became spread out all over across the globe. And I'm not saying this to diminish the responsibility of what the United States did in Latin America, no, by no means, but those were not the only ones, the bad guys of the story, not the only ones. So there was, the third point is a toll of thousands of victims among insurgents and unarmed civilians. And well, this is the most outrageous aspect of the dirty wars in these countries. Most of the victims were civilians, people who were not participating in the conflict. They were relatives, neighbors, friends of people who were involved in the armed organizations, but they were personally not fighting the government. They didn't have weapons, and that's very disturbing to realize that most of the victims were innocent people. And I'm not saying that the combatants were not innocent. I mean, most of the combatants died, were killed, or disappeared when they were already arrested. So to some extent, they were also innocent because they were unarmed. They were not in conditions to fight anymore. They still were subjected to extrajudicial practices. So the role, the fourth point is the role of victims and survivors in the formation of a grassroots human rights movement. And this happened in every single country where the victims were the ones who organized to fight these human rights abuses, not the civil society. Most people were the so-called like silent minority. Most people decide to turn a blind eye to with this violence. So were the victims, the same people that suffer repression and abuses were the same ones who organized against this to hold accountable the perpetrators. And the fifth point is the struggles for memory and justice to give meaning and significance to that period. So in every single case, even the Mexican case that is so little known, there were people that has been a very committed and adamant in promoting an agenda for memory and justice, truth and justice since the 60s to present day. So they have been very consistent, like across all these decades. The succession of events in these four countries was more or less the same, but the background in each country was very different. So for me, the context, the historical context, is why that explain what the differences among these countries and the conflicts in each country. And well, this is very obvious, but sometimes people miss the context. So I think that Mexico, well, this is one of my key arguments. I think Mexico, notwithstanding that Mexico was the only country that experienced a revolution in the 20th century, the very famous Mexican Revolution that happened from the 1910s to the 1920s, a new generation emerged in the 60s, advocating for another revolution. This is rather unique. After a revolution that took the lives of 1 or 2 million people, a new generation asked for another revolution. And I think that's we should wonder why. That did not happen that often in any country, but it happened in Mexico. A second major difference is that no foreign power was interested in overthrowing the established regime. Even though Mexico, had that de facto one-party regime, there was no any country that thought, oh, wait a minute, Mexico is not democratic. Let's overthrow the PRI. The PRI is the Institutional Revolutionary Party that ruled over Mexico for 70 years. So that was not the case with Chile. Chile had a vibrant democracy. However, the United States were totally interested in destabilizing the Chilean government. So that was not the case of Mexico. And that's a very major difference. A third difference is that Mexico had more clandestine armed organizations than any other country in Latin America. So people, before we did research on these clandestine organizations, we thought that Mexico had very few guerrilla movements. They are usually popularly called guerrilla movements. But it happens that Mexico had more than 40 guerrilla organizations. No other country, not Chile, Brazil, Argentina, not have so many organizations of this type. The fourth major difference is that the dirty war was carried out not by the dictatorship, but by an authoritarian government with populist overtones. So one of the most populist presidents in the Cold War period, which was Luis Echeverría, was the one who was more violent and more evil against the opposition. And I am using the word evil. It's a word that historians don't like that much, but that guy was evil. Believe me, that guy was evil. And I use that word very carefully. So special cases, this was a special case, Echeverría. And he was a populist. I mean, you listen to his discourse, he portrayed himself as a leftist, and Lázaro Cárdenas. Lázaro Cárdenas was a very progressive president back in the 30s. And so this is very disturbing that a president that portrays himself as a leftist was the one who exterminated the radical left. Yeah, Mexico is like a comedy, I know. So the sixth major point is the fifth, that the conflict happened not in the urban context, like in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, that most of the violence happened in the cities, in the capital of each country, but and other major cities. But the worst part of the Mexican dirty war, the violence happened in the countryside. There was no witness. There was these regions were very isolated. There was no press, domestic press or international press to cover the conflict. So it was a conflict that went unnoticed because of the geographical conditions. And the fact that these regions, mostly in the highlands, the northern highlands and the southern highlands of Mexico, were very far away from the centers of political power. So the sixth point of difference is that the dirty war ended not with a transition to democracy. In Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, all the conflicts ended with, the elections, free democratic elections. Well, there are some controversy, but let's say that those were free and democratic elections. In the Mexican case, there was a combination of consensus and violence expressed through the political reform, the 1977 political reform that allowed the left-wing parties to participate in elections. There was also an amnesty for political prisoners in 1978. Most of these prisoners were either guerrilla fighters, had been guerrilla fighters, or drug growers. And I will explain why the intertwining of the dirty war on drugs later. And these were two major political reforms that created a climate of democratization, even though it was not like full democracy. There was no free elections. The PRI remained in power for another 20 years. But these measures paved the way for free elections. That's why Mexico now can alternate between right-wing parties and center parties. Well, I wouldn't say that the current president is leftist. Many people call him a leftist. In my opinion, he's not a leftist at all. But the fact is that Mexico now have free elections, but that process started like 23 years ago with these reforms. Well, 30 years ago with these reforms. So the seventh point is that, but it's important, the combination of these political reforms, while at the same time, the government kept exterminating the armed organizations. That did not happen in Chile, Brazil, or Argentina. After the transition to democracy, there were still some radicals out there, but there was a rule of law. The rule of law was established. In Mexico, no. In Mexico, there were these reforms, but the government kept killing the opponents in very, of course, illegal with illegal methods. The 7 point of difference is that the extreme right, in Latin America, we call the extreme right wingers fachos. And there's a discussion whether they were actual fascists or not. I won't get into that discussion. Well, if you want to ask me at the end of my talk, that's okay, but I won't touch upon that now. So the extreme right, which play a major role in the cases of Chile and Argentina, did not play a relevant role in the Mexican conflict. Mexico had a far right wing, like any other Latin American country, but this was, even though it was a strong far right wing, and it was not allowed to participate in elections, they contributed to fight radicals and to some extent, but it was not a significant force. Like for instance, in Chile, the right wing played a major role in Chile and Argentina. In Argentina, the most emblematic case is the AAA, the Anti-Communist Alliance. Mexico did not have a AAA. The 8 point of difference is that Mexico was the only country that received thousands of exiles from the radical or revolutionary left in Latin America, while their own exiles, the Mexican exiles, were sent to Cuba. So this is very odd because, well, Mexico is portraying itself as this humanitarian country that is like very committed to the asylum policies, and is helping all these refugees. And many of these refugees had been guerrillas in their own countries. But what Mexico did with their own revolutionaries was like very outrageous. You know, they were like, it's such a contradictory policy, you know, like receiving the radicals from outside, exterminating the local radicals, or send them to exile in Cuba. Cuba was the only country that received the Mexican exiles. No other country wanted to receive them because there was this idea that, oh, Mexico is okay. Why people want to flee a country like Mexico? So there was an international perception of Mexico as a very progressive country, as a country that was doing well despite of, you know, having a one-party regime. And the Mexican government masterfully created this good image for political purposes, of course. It worked. So no Amnesty, International Amnesty, or any other human rights organization ever indicted the Mexican government. Well, indicted, metaphorically speaking, you know, for all these crimes. So Mexico avoided international scrutiny for its domestic dirty work. The PRI regime, well, this is the 10th point, is that the PRI regime was the only, I'm sorry, the 11th, was it the only, I think the only regime in the region that was remarkably successful in covering up and silencing state crimes for a very long time. You know, it took decades for the dirty work to become a topic of public discussion, public conversation. So I cannot think of any other regime. Well, I'm not expert in world history, but at least in Latin America or in the Americas, any other regime that have been so successful in hiding a war. Like, if you know about any other country in which this happened, please let me know. That would be fascinating to compare the cases, but I haven't found any case in which a dirty and our internal conflict was not even acknowledged. Finally, the 12th point is that Mexico was the last Latin American country to reckon with its repressive past. I told you in 2000, well, there was this initiative to create the Special Prosecutor's Office, but that did nothing because the same repressors were in charge of carrying out prosecutions. Of course, they wouldn't indict themselves. But Mexico, in this administration, the López Obrador administration, recently, 2 years ago, created a Truth Commission, which is the first Truth Commission in Mexico. There were other like Truth Commissions at a local scale, like Truth Commission to investigate the 1968 massacre of students, or the Truth Commission for the state of Guerrero to investigate the dirty war, because Guerrero was the state in which the dirty war was the most vicious and took a higher toll, death toll. But Mexico never had a national truth commission. So this was meant to be the first national truth commission. However, the way in which the president distorted the functioning of this commission is disturbing, because he called this commission a presidential commission. So that is a contradiction in terms. Cannot be a truth commission and a presidential commission. I mean, it has to be the concept of a truth commission has to be an independent truth commission. So when I participated in the process to be part of the truth commission, and I was not admitted. So, but then because I participated in the process, I learned it from inside that it was a sham, but we can discuss that later. So as you can see, there are more differences between Mexico's dirty war than similarities, but this doesn't mean that we should like set the Mexican case apart. This only means that we should do more research and to understand these peculiarities. Because Mexico, no doubt, was a very violent country. It was not a peaceful country. It was stable somehow compared, to these other countries, but the violence, it was a stability based on both consensus and violence. Not a stability based on development and modernization and as a PRI claim. And there's another important aspect in which the Mexican case is completely different. And I think I have to skip that for some reason. This here, it should be here. Sorry. Oh yeah, I skipped reading this part, sorry. So there's a significant, I think one of the major differences between the Mexican case and the other cases is that the fact in which the dirty war was intertwined with the so-called war on drugs, because those conflicts happened at the same time. In the late 1960s, in the mid 1960s started the dirty war. In 1969 started the war on drugs, fostered by Richard Nixon's policy of the war on drugs. Nixon called it the war on drugs. So Mexico was pushed by Nixon to follow this idea of militarizing the war on drugs. Although, well, it was not, I don't want you to think about the war on drugs as just as a US imposition. No, it was not that way. It was that the PRI understood the war on drugs as an opportunity to accomplish some goals of the domestic agenda. For instance, the elimination of the opposition, the control on the rural parts of the country, the countryside, that the PRI had any control. This idea of the PRI as a super strong political party that control everything is plainly wrong. There were many parts of the country that the PRI had no idea what those were about. They lack control. They don't have any say on those regions. So the PRI understood this conflict as an opportunity to be more involved in the countryside, to control local opposition, and to make business, because the PRI was a keystone in the formation of networks of corruption, collusion between organized crime and all the officers and officials that belong to different national security agencies, including the military, the armed forces, of course. So part of the dirty war was funded with drug trafficking money. And there's so little research about this. It's disturbing because we found more and more evidence that connects the dirty war with the war on drugs, and that even there are documents, CIA documents, that reveal that the war on drugs was used like as an excuse to exterminate the left. However, there's very, very little research about this, which I don't understand why, because Americans love doing research on everything, and these topics have received very poor attention. So the fact that Mexico, well, had these two dual conflict, the war on drugs and the dirty work, was the key moment in which these conflicts between completely intertwined was the so-called Operation Condor. And if you know something about the history of Latin America also had an Operation Condor. So how is that Mexico had an Operation Condor at the same time that Latin America, the southern countries also had an Operation Condor, but these Operation Condors were not the same. They had nothing to do. They shared the same name, same characteristics. The Mexican government, but the key difference is that Mexican government was using this Operation Condor to kill both drug growers and traffickers and revolutionaries, while Operation Condor in the Southern Cone and the Andes became an operation to exterminate the left in general, not only the radical left, not only the guerrilla movements, but the whole left, like even people who belong to, the liberation theology movement, like that. That's why there are so many priests and nuns that were killed or disappeared. People who were teaching, in the shanty towns for free, illiteracy campaigns. I mean, anyone who had any progressive thought in their heads was seen as an internal enemy, as a military target. Even people, that's why the dirty war produced so many civilian victims, people who had no involvement at all in revolutionary organizations. So the targets were different, clearly different. Mexican target only mostly the people involved in guerrilla movements and the drug growers and traffickers. The Latin American Condor targeted anyone who had anything to do with the left or the progressive thought, However, the methods were identical: forced disappearance, a large scale, extrajudicial killings, extensive torture, the scorched earth policy. The scorched earth policy happened even more in Mexico because most of the conflict will occur in the countryside. In Argentina, there were military campaigns in the countryside in both in Chile and Argentina, but I wouldn't say that they went full-fledged to a scorched earth policy. But because it was not needed, there was not so much resistance in the countryside. But the idea is that it's not because the repressive forces in those southern countries did not want to, it was not needed. But the mindset was the same. People, in the three countries, Mexico, Chile, and Argentina, there were the so-called death flights. The people were, that I don't know if you have heard about the death flights, people were taken into flights, like usually military airplanes, and they were tossed into the Pacific Ocean. And this is very disturbing because in Mexico, people were tossed in both the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. But when I think in the geography of the death flights in the Pacific Ocean, it goes from Mexico to Chile. That's really outrageous. So of course, most of the people who were tossed to the ocean, they were the disappeared ones. We never heard of them. We cannot find their bodies because, they are in the bottom of the sea. And these methods were there has never been any research comparing, the death flights in all these countries, and I wonder why they should be. And there's so much there's so much research needed on these topics, and I hope I'm giving you ideas about what to explore, because even though these topics are so disturbing, people still are searching for answers about what happened with the disappear, who were the perpetrators of these death flights. And if we look at it at a continental scale, it makes more sense. Because the armies were coordinated. Even though the Mexican army did not have strong connections with the armies in the Southern Cone, still they were communicating, they were sharing information. They're responsible for the death flights in Mexico. The General Francisco Quiroz Hermosillo traveled to Argentina after the military coup in 1976. for a diplomatic mission. Mexico started the dead flights in the early 1970s, way before the military coup in Argentina. So it was this guy, precisely this guy, who was an expert in dead flights, the guy who was sent to Argentina to a military mission right away, the military coup. So these are the type of facts that need to be investigated. And finally, well, I have a couple of minutes left. I will say that when, well, all these countries that transition to democracy, they develop other problems, other issues. But in the case of Mexico, Mexico was ended this period of violence, the dirty war in the mid-1980s, early to mid-1980s, when the Federal Security Directorate was dissolved. The Federal Security Directorate was the organization, was Mexico's secret police, they resemble the CIA. Actually, the DFS is the acronym. The DFS, which was the Mexican CIA, was completely connected to the CIA. It reported to the CIA all the information, most of the information that the DFS created was shared with the CIA office in Mexico. So the DFS was dissolved in 1985 because of corruption, because the DFS grew as an agency that was totally in partnership with the drug lords. If you have seen the series Narcos Mexico, well, you have seen have an idea about how this partnership what was this partnership about. And so the DFS protected drug lords. The DFS agents, they became drug lords themselves, some of them, and they were involved in the killing of Enrique Camarena, this DEA agent. But I won't delve into that. But it's important to understand that one of the major outcomes of the Mexican dirty war was this collusion between organized crime and Mexican agents, state agents. And this is a long-lasting pattern that is still affecting the Mexican institutions. And it's a pattern that helps to explain why Mexico is such a violent country in present day, because usually these pacts were local pacts, like the Mexican state agents that participate in the national security agencies. They received this payoff for their counterinsurgency activity in the way of being enabled to profit from drug trafficking, from the drug trade. So this profitable activity, well, there has never been anything that caught with these practices, anything that put an end to these practices. So from the dirty war to present day, the agencies, agencies in charge of national security are still making a profit out of the drug trade and other illegal activities. But it started in the 60s and 70s. It started with the dirty war. And this is one of the major differences between the Mexican conflict and what happened in the other countries. I will end my talk here. But I think it's important to I think that this comparative analysis yields for understanding violence in its own terms, and also, but in the larger terms, in regional terms, and also it helps us to understand the legacies of this violence. In the case of Mexico, it's still a very violent country, one of the probably the most violent country in Latin America to present day. In the case of Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, with all their complications and issues and so on and so forth, I think they are doing better than Mexico in terms of violence, in terms of internal, political stability. Mexico, well, this is a super complicated situation that we are living now. But the origin of all this is definitely the dirty war. I hope that there's more research on the dirty war. There's more comparative research of Mexico with other conflicts. And thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Adela, for your presentation. We have about 15 minutes for questions. If you're in the audience in the Zoom call, please just open your mic. Or if we have a question here from the room, just please come to the front and or Luis.
I will walk up.
Yeah.
If you need it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, it's very interesting that you chose those three countries to compare Mexico with. Why did you say you left out Guatemala?
Oh, because Guatemala experienced a very long-lasting civil war. So what we see in Guatemala, I mean, Mexico is very mild compared to Guatemala. Guatemala experienced the genocide of the Maya population. 200,000 people were killed. The paramilitary forces, the armed forces were very well organized in Guatemala. So it's like the whole country was organized for waging this counterinsurgency war against the guerrilla movements, which was not the case of Mexico. Mexico still had institutions. It's like a dual situation. Like there's a war, but on the surface, there's also functional institutions providing services to people, creating a climate of somehow like stability or the fiction of peace, because the dirty war was so secret, so clandestine. So and it happened mostly in the countryside. So the two countries are distinctly different. And in Guatemala, no, Guatemala is a whole country like organized to kill this vulnerable Maya rural population.
Adela, how you doing? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
Go ahead.
That was a great talk. Thank you. But I'm going to make your task a little harder because you could include South Africa and Namibia in a lot of this, particularly the death flights, because they had death flights as well. And I think there was actually a link with somebody from the Argentine government and the apartheid army. So it might be worth taking the strand a little further. But I actually wanted to ask about the relationship of this study to the Iguala 43.
No pics are literally.
I don't know how to make it a question, but
Yeah, actually, you mean the 43 students that were disappearing in Iguala? Yeah, that's very interesting because when people realize that the responsible for the people, the forces that kidnapped the students were a combination of like these drug cartels and state agents from several police and military agencies, people started to understand like the deep level of collusion between organized crime and Mexican agencies in charge of national security. But they thought that this problem started like with the war on drugs that officially began in 2006. And some people say, no, it's a longer history. It started in the 70s with the movements by Lucio Cabañas and Genaro Vázquez, which are the most emblematic guerrilla leaders in the 70s. But actually, it's even before Lucio and Cabañas and Genaro Vázquez. I mean, this partnership, this complicity
Did I
goes back
see
to the
Jay?
1920s, 1930s of the 20th century, you know. In the 20th century, so the collusion was always there, but violence, the dirty war and the war on drugs in the 70s, 60s and 70s made everything.
Why do you
worse.
think?
And it's a problem that has never been addressed. There has never been measures, institutional measures, domestically or internationally, to put an end to this collusion. And that's why what makes Mexican population so vulnerable to these crimes. All sorts of atrocities happen in Mexico because of these combined forces, illegal and legal forces. And the population has the possibility of protect themselves, defend themselves, because there's no rule of law. There's no one that can protect the Mexican people. And I think that's one of the legacies of this long-lasting violence that has been neglected for so long. Because if you don't address the problem, if you don't understand what the problem is, of course, you are not going to seek for solutions. And that's exactly what's happening in Mexico. Like people are turning a blind eye to the fact that these Mexican institutions are so rotten. because now with this current administration, people have hope, like, oh no, this administration is the one that is gonna correct all these mistakes, past mistakes and bad practices. But the problem is so deep, so structural, that yeah, we don't know. And I always get this question: what are we gonna do with the war on drugs in Mexico? How we are gonna put an end to this violence that is affecting mostly the Mexican population and immigrants. Immigrants have paid a high price when they arrive in Mexico. And I don't have an answer, because it has become such a transnational problem. You know, the drug trafficking and of course the role of the United States in this conflict. So it's such a complex problem, and I don't know. I'm not surprised about reading news about violent events in Mexico every day, extreme violence, like the most recent this year, like what happened with 41 immigrants. They were burned in a shelter. So this type of outrageous events happen on a regular basis, because there's nothing that stop all these networks of combined legal and illegal actors. And well, that's I hope at least we can discuss more on that, because the Mexican war on drugs is like not a topic of conversation in the United States. People focus on drug lords and all the spectacular violence, the show, the dramatic aspects, but not what like the political, economic aspects of it. Yeah, that's an exception. Yeah, but this like a single guy that is indicted when there's the top official, but still it's not enough. And it's only like if the Mexican authorities were corrupt. What about corruption on this side of the border? The corruption that allows tons of drugs coming into the country every year. That's corruption too, I mean. But thank you very much for the people in South Africa.
We have 3 questions from people online, and then we have a few more here in the room.
Sure.
We're going to probably extend a little more after one. But Saida, you want to open your mic? You can ask your question.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Adela. I am in the School of Education here at UW, and I am my research is about the impact of the war on drugs in the school. I've been doing research in Mexico City, and one of my questions, I have too many questions, so maybe we can continue the conversation. But one of my questions is, so you were mentioning that there's a point where the dirty war and the war on drugs intertwined, and you talk about the Operation Condor and how like the state was using similar methods, for example, forced disappearance, militarization of the territory. But I was thinking that also there are a lot of differences in these 2 moments. I was working with the Centro de Derechos Humanos Miguel Agustín Pro Juárez in Mexico City. So yeah, I can see that there's a lot of differences. So maybe you can talk a little bit about it. I am thinking, for example, in the nature of the victims. We were working with Alicia de los Ríos, but also with Colectivos de Madres Buscadoras, which is kind of like a very different, like victims, for example, are very different in these 2 contexts. So I don't know if you have some other ideas of that, like the differences between these wars.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the war on drugs and the dirty war in the 70s, they brought about, well, thousands of victims that were never acknowledged, or no one ever took the time to count them. And this is very disturbing, because again, Americans love numbers. I don't get why no one has ever done quantitative research on the Mexican dirty war and the war on drugs of the 70s. But in terms of, but the fact that we don't know what happened. I mean, my first estimate was 3,000 victims, but now that every time I go to the archives, I look at the files, I think, no, it's a very low estimate. The victims, I mean, there were thousands of victims and we have no idea because this was totally covered up. And this is another very odd aspect of the Mexican case, that we know about the victims because official files, not even because every victim is talking. So the victims are there in the official files. We must count them. Second, the victims of the dirty war on the war on drugs were the same. They were in the same states, in the same regions, oddly enough. And that's why, well, of course, they were targeted for different reasons, but the methods applied against them were the same: torture, disappearance, death flights, etc. But in the case of the second war on drugs, from the Felipe Calderon's term, 2006 to present day, it's even like the methods were perfectionate, amplified, multiplied because of the experience that drug cartels gain in, for instance, some of the most violent, the most vicious were groups were like the Zetas or the Citas. They were trained by Caidiles, which was a specialized counterinsurgency paramilitary group in Guatemala, the most violent, the most like people. And that's why in Mexico the war on drugs is now more and more violent, more lethal. That they usually burn the victims to avoid any like that the families and relatives find them. So it's all this, that violence has become a lot worse, and that's why it's more difficult now. Well, it was difficult in the 70s. It's difficult now to understand what happened to the victims. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have a question here in the room, and then we have the last two questions from Carlos and Patricio. So.
So thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. And I was kind of wondering that, so it seemed like from what I was hearing, it seemed like part of Mexico's problem was a lack of like capacity to govern its rural areas. And I was wondering what kind of like infrastructural changes you would see that would be like beneficial in helping like stabilize the country. And I also know that there's like a clause within the Mexican Constitution that talks about like indigenous people being able to form their own militias. So like what I wanted your take to see if you think those kind of institutions help amplify the drug problem, considering so many of these militias at times turn to like the drug trade as well.
You're talking about the present period? Yeah. And can you repeat the question, because well, there was like many questions, but the key question would be
like, how do you think, like what institutional / infrastructural changes do you think would be beneficial to stabilizing the country?
Well, the fact that this second war on drugs is also fight with counterinsurgency methods is very interesting, because counterinsurgency is not only about killing people and disappearing. No, it's also about creating infrastructure to control the population. So there's institutions, there are some social expenditure to create institutions to control people, to give them jobs and to create a relative social peace. But that's why these wars are so complex, because on the one hand, you see people working, producing, doing their lives. On the other hand, extreme violence, people being kidnapped and killed all the time. But that's a problem. There are institutional building on the spite of all this violence. So I don't think that a specific institutional development would benefit or would avoid or would stop violence. It's a lot more complex than that, because counterinsurgency itself, so many institutions were created, for instance, in the 70s to prevent that more people revolt against the government. So those institutions were created specifically to avoid insurgency, to prevent insurgency. So institutionalizing, I don't think, institutional building, I don't think that's going to fix it. Also, we have the problem with, in present day, the transnational corporations like the Canadian mining companies, they partnered with organized crime, with the militias, the military, the paramilitary of the groups of that belonging to organized crime, to control, to kill, the opponents, the leaders, the local leaders that are opposing, the use of the territory, the mining in their territory. So that's why I say it's a transnational problem that can only be addressed at a transnational level. Of course, the Mexican government must do its part, but it's such a, there are so many transnational actors involved. It's like probably like South Africa, that makes more sense. The Congo, South Africa, it makes more sense to compare to those countries, the Mexican case, because in Latin America, well, we see that, but not to the scale that we see in Mexico with all this violence going on.
Thank you. So we have the last two questions. Patricio, you want to open your mic, and Carlos, let's take it at the same time, and then we'll just wrap it with that.
Yeah. Hello, Adela. Thank you very much.
Your
Nice
mic.
to meet you. Whoa. I should have combed my hair, I guess. Adela, I'm gonna ask you a question. It's a bit uncomfortable. I'm originally from Chile, and my generation, we lived the dictatorship and we lived the Cold War, what you're saying. But my question, and many people of my generation in Chile, in relation with the United States, is basically, I mean, can we believe anything from the scholarship of the country that was up to its neck in this stuff, that promoted this stuff, that supported this stuff? I mean, can we believe in it? Can we believe that there is a reflection, a serious reflection, and it's going to happen in the place where all this was in more ways than one organized? I know it's an uncomfortable question, but that's a reality that in Latin America, especially my generation, we live it on a constant basis. Can we believe that?
Next question.
Carlos, you want to ask your question, and then we can just ask those two.
Okay. Hola, profe. Espero esté bien. My question is the following. In what ways is there a relationship between like international economic institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the suppression that in this case in Mexico, the dirty war waged against, popular opposition to say economic reforms or like policies that would negatively affect the majority of the population?
Yeah, well, I will start with Carlos because I find that easier to respond. Sorry, Patricia. But well, first, the IMF, of course, had an influence on the Mexican economy as they were, well, the main lenders of money. But during the dirty war, they played no role because the Mexican, that was the time when Mexican governments were populist. They defended a model of an economic model based on protectionism and nationalism. So they tried to they were not fully connected with this international economic system. Like, of course, there were ties and agreements and so on and so forth, but no, they were not as strong as they became later during the so-called neoliberal era in the 80s, when Mexico definitely relied on these international lenders. So in the 70s, because of this nationalist model of the economy, no, they played no role as far as I know. Patricio, I don't fully understand your question. If your question is that in America, we don't have the right to, or the moral ground to do research on the...
Adela, I'm not going to do a statement on the reasons. I know the US, I live in the US. I got my PhD in the University of Texas that has a wonderful Latin American program. I know that the US is a very complex place in which there's many people that thinks very differently. I'm aware of that complexity. But overall, I think I'm venting a doubt that many of my colleagues in Latin America have, no? Can we really believe a country that was involved up to its neck in creating all that stuff? It sounds like very similar when the Spanish began talking about colonialisms and, how bad this and that, and they invented colonialism. You know, so the US was up to its neck and everything, you know, the CIA, not only the School of the Americas, that was only the military part, but then the CIA, the executive, and you name it. I mean, the US has it's up to his neck in this stuff. So can we really say, right, there's gonna be, you know, solid and serious and in-depth scholarship coming out of all these situations?
Well,
Among other things, yeah.
That's a rhetoric question that I cannot answer, but I am from Mexico and I did most of my research in Mexico.
Yeah.
I don't know what to tell you about it.
Mm.
Yeah, believe me, it was not in the heart of the empire.
Yeah, sorry, it's a hard question, but
Thank you.
Very good. All right, well, we ran out of time, but again, thank you so much, Adela,
Thank
for coming back to Madison. Thank you, all of you who joined us.
thank you much.